Hello again, friends. Happy Monday and welcome to another reading vlog. This week I thought I would do a bit of an author taste test. Just to cut to the chase because you've seen the thumbnail, Agustina Bastarrica is a Latina horror author who I've wanted to read from for quite some time. I've owned her first translated novella, Tender is the Flesh, for I want to say the past 4 or 5 years. And she just had another novella translated into English called The Unworthy, which I would consider to be one of my most anticipated releases of 2025. That one literally just came out on March 4th, so I thought now would be as good a time as any to finally try out her books. So that is what I'm gonna do this week. I have both of them right here with me. I will give you a brief overview of each and then decide which one I'm gonna dive into first. Just going in publication order, let's talk about Tender is the Flesh. This is a dystopian horror novella set in a future where an infectious virus has made animal meat and products poisonous to humans. So the government has enacted the transition wherein it is now legal to butcher, process, and consume human meat instead. And I believe the story is following a butcher who works in one of these meat processing plants where it's forbidden for employees to interact with the human products for obvious reasons, but he accidentally becomes attached to a person who is being processed for consumption. It sounds gruesome, I know, and from what I've heard, it is, but I also think it's imagining an extreme scenario in order to explore the limitations or boundaries of humanity, especially in a capitalistic society that is often seeking new ways to dehumanize us. Then we have The Unworthy. This is her most recent translation, like I said. It's another dystopian horror story, but it's also religious horror, which is very much my jam. It's set in the near future when climate change and natural disasters have ravaged the earth to the point where it's uninhabitable and unsafe. But there are these underground convents where the quote-unquote faithful can find refuge while the outside world continues to fall into chaos. The main character, I believe, is living in one of these convents and dreaming of climbing the ranks to become enlightened. But when a stranger breaks into the convent, she forces the main character to reconsider everything she's buried about the outside world and what she might be overlooking about this convent. I think this one might also be queer. I'm not sure how or to what degree or extent, but we will find out. The rule follower in me feels like I should read them in publication order, but you know what? I don't feel like following the rules. I kind of feel like going against the grain, so I think I'm going to start with The Unworthy first. Libro FM actually provided their influencers with an ALC of The Unworthy, so I think I'm going to try out the audiobook first as I work, but if that doesn't work out for some reason, I obviously have this physical book to read from as well. So that's pretty much all I have for you at the moment. We're just getting things going here. These are both fairly short, so I should hopefully be able to finish them no problem by the end of the work week, if not sooner. Fingers crossed. So I will check in tomorrow and let you know how it's going. Hello again, friends. Happy Tuesday. I think this is going to be a fairly brief update because I was able to get a really good start on The Unworthy yesterday, but I have not finished it yet. Actually, to be honest, the not finishing was very much on purpose. I could have very easily blazed through this entire audiobook yesterday. I certainly had enough time, but I forced myself to stop around the 60% mark so I could give you some in-progress thoughts. I mean, my first and most pressing thought is that this shit is bonkers, which is great. The weirder, the better, in my very humble opinion. I do want to make a slight correction from yesterday because I was assuming this was more of a cli-fi dystopian, and while climate change has definitely destroyed the outside world, there's also some kind of infectious virus that has taken hold of humankind. That's not a major part of the story, but I do think it's interesting that writing about deadly infectious diseases is potentially a through line in both books. The main character is a fascinating person, to say the very least. There's an interesting tension within her because on the one hand, she is an avid believer in this cult, in this religion that everyone in the convent follows, and she earnestly wants to become part of the convent's inner circle. But on the other hand, she has this feral, violent, unhinged soul that is not what you would consider to be pure of heart. So those two parts of herself are very much fighting against each other, and it's interesting to see how those two motivations can coexist in one person. I also have to say, though, I do love a nasty little unrepentant soul, and that is very much who this main character is. The plotline about this outsider infiltrating the convent is also fascinating to me because it's not just a matter of someone breaching what are supposed to be unbreachable boundaries, but her presence at the convent is also causing strange things to happen. So it's making me wonder about her story and who she really is. Thematically, I'm also vibing with what the story is exploring. It's not only wrestling with this this false idea that we can separate ourselves from the ugliness and harsh reality of the world if we only distance ourselves enough, as if we're not inherently interconnected with everything and everyone on the planet, but also how easily so many of us are willing to sacrifice other people in order to gain some semblance of moral superiority, which is folly because being morally superior cannot and will not save us. So it's also kind of asking that question of how much of ourselves, our humanity, and our obligation to our fellow people are we willing to sink into these unsustainable systems of power that prioritize the self over the collective. So a lot of really interesting concepts and ideas coming into play. I'm really curious to see how the author is going to tie everything together by the end. Hopefully it'll get even darker and stranger than it already has, but we will just have to see. I will definitely be finishing this today, and I will give you my final thoughts tomorrow before moving on to Tender is the Flesh. Well, I think it's safe to say things did indeed get weirder. Hello again, friends. It is currently Wednesday, and as promised, I was able to finish The Unworthy last night. I'm still very much processing what happened in the story and how it made me feel, especially because, of course, as this is a novella, a lot has to transpire and conclude in a very short amount of space. But long story short, I definitely dug this. I like that the horror in this story doesn't stem from something supernatural or paranormal, but rather the true and visceral horror that only humans can create for themselves. I forgot to mention this yesterday, but I really have to tip my hat to the translator, Sarah Moses, because I think she was able to really capture the flow and the urgency of the prose. There's almost a relentlessness to the way the story is continuously pushing forward, sometimes so abruptly that the main character doesn't even have time to finish writing out her thoughts. And I felt like that really supported the overall tone and eeriness of the story. Another thing I meant to mention yesterday is the moral tension warring within the main character is also beautifully tied into the structure of the story, which is told through a series of diary entries. And even just the presence of a diary to begin with presents an interesting wrinkle for the main character because, like I said, she presents herself as extremely devout, and even just the existence of her secret diary suggests a seed of defiance and doubt. And as the reader, that makes you lean in and begin to wonder why this person who's so devout would take such a big risk as keeping a diary and basically keeping a record of her own imperfection in the first place. So I found that framing device to be effective, and I think the main character grapples with it and justifies it in really satisfying ways, because she talks a lot about how writing down her story makes her life real in some ways and allows her life to have meaning and impact beyond herself, even if that record and even if that life is deeply imperfect. And I think because of the religious overtones, there's also an element of confession that is captured in the diary entries, which I also found to be incredibly effective. I feel like I touched on a lot of the thematic work yesterday, a lot of that carried over through to the end, as you would expect, but I also really appreciate what the story has to say about how the phenomenon of artificial distance not only makes it easier for us to see only what it is we want to see, but also makes us far more susceptible to overlooking what it is that others don't want us to see, which is perhaps even more dangerous. All in all, this was wild. Definitely some big content warnings for graphic violence, physical torture, and some descriptions of rape and assault, among other things, but overall, as strange as it might sound to say, I enjoyed my time with this, and I would give it a solid 4.5 stars. Now, I was hoping to have at least started Tender is the Flesh before this update so I could give you my initial thoughts, but I just have so much going on right now, so that did not happen, but I will be diving into this today, reading from the physical book, and I will let you know more next time. Hello, my friends. We meet again. It is now Thursday, and I'm here to give you a quick update on my progress in Tender is the Flesh. I was hoping to make it to the halfway point yesterday, but that did not end up happening just because yesterday turned out to be a very eventful and very exhausting day. But I was able to get to the 58-page mark. Unsurprisingly, this story is definitely intense, not for the faint of heart. So far, nothing graphic has happened on page, but I think even just the discussions of breeding, butchering, and consuming humans can be pretty intense for obvious reasons. Based on the story's conceit, I don't know why I did not realize this, but because of the legalization of cannibalism in this world, it's led to a new kind of human that is specifically specifically bred for consumption, not socialized, not taught how to speak, not given any rights, just a brand of human that is purely product. The main character, Tejo, is very interesting because he feels very detached, almost listless. He has no interest in participating in this kind of economy, but he's also resigned to the fact that his job forces him to come face to face with human products. There's a conflicting dichotomy there because internally he refuses to comply with this rebranding of meat products, but at the same time, he's participating in the very system that he despises. Something I appreciate most about his internal narration is the way he thinks about language, especially how language can be propagated and misused in order to distance ourselves from hard truths. If we don't call something what it is, if we don't call murder, murder, if we don't call genocide, genocide, if we don't call violence, violence, we remove its power, its urgency, its truth. We create, again, a sort of artificial distance that keeps us from engaging with the world's ugliness, which makes it easier for us not to be accountable for whatever role we might play in that ugliness. And the story is really exploring how language is being misused and appropriated, how people find it easier to lean on familiar euphemisms when it comes to consuming human meat, and how that use of language actually normalizes the act of dehumanization itself. So I'm loving what this story has to say about that. I'm just now at the part of the story where Tejo has been quote unquote gifted a woman bred for sale and consumption. And especially because there's a communication barrier between the two of them, I'm really curious to see how that relationship develops. Again, the very conceit of this story is intense and can be hard to read at times. But as I said on day one, I think the intensity is very purposeful and meant to discomfort and astonish the reader into recognizing these same dangerous patterns and systems that are very much already at play in our world, but just exaggerated here for narrative effect. It keeps feeling bizarre to say this given what this story is about, but I am very much enjoying what I've read so far. If I can finish this one today, I will, but either way, we will find out in my next update. Hello friends, we have made it to Friday, and we've also officially made it to the end of the vlog. I was able to read over 100 pages of Tender is the Flesh last night, and I finished up the last bit this morning, so let's talk thoughts. There is a lot happening in this short little book, so much more than I could possibly address here in this moment. But ultimately, my takeaway from this book is that it's intense, it's in your face, it's purposefully over the top, and it's not going to be for everyone, and that's okay. But even though it is difficult to read at times, and there are definitely moments that are a bit much, when all is said and done, I understand and respect this story's project. I feel like this should go without saying, but there's not exactly a positive spin on this story. There's not really a way this story could end on a hopeful note without feeling completely out of left field or totally disingenuous. But I will say, especially with a main character who is intellectually dissenting, I would have liked to see those seeds planted into more revolutionary action on his part. I understand what the story is trying to do, but I feel like it's missing a little bit of that catharsis. But like I talked about before, I do find that dissonance in the main character to be not only fascinating, but also a truthful reflection of how so many people can identify and name corruption, injustice, and systemic oppression for themselves, and yet never do a single thing to fight back against those issues. Marcos, which is the main character's first name by the way, embodies all of the worst parts of society that intellectually he rails against. He judges other people for not thinking for themselves, for accepting and normalizing horrific social norms, and yet he will turn around and do all those same things, and even do things that are perhaps worse. His relationship with the human woman he's gifted is especially uncomfortable, and I think intentionally so, because that really troubling power dynamic reflects the systemic dehumanization that so much of the world has accepted, so long as it means upholding the status quo and securing their own sense of safety. Because if you're not bred for slaughter, then you must be morally, intellectually, and socially superior. It's kind of interesting that both books in this vlog grapple with the false currency of moral superiority and how far people are willing to go to preserve their own safety, even if it means disregarding the safety of others. So again, even though Marcos internally refuses to adhere to the norms established by the government and society, he's still not above using human products to his own ends and actively taking part in the very system he despises. And I think that really speaks to how there's a world of difference between recognizing injustice and actually moving to act against it. Like I hinted at before, I do think there are a few moments in the story where the violence and the intensity are a bit gratuitous, not really adding anything significant to the story besides depicting cruelty and discomfort. Intellectually, I understand the intent, but I just don't think the story actually actually needed all of those moments. I did find the world building in this story to be more successful and more well thought out than the world building of The Unworthy, and again, even though it can be quite a gruesome story, I do appreciate the underlying message and the author's refusal to let the reader off the hook, so to speak. I know this author also has a translated collection of short stories called 19 Claws and a Blackbird. It's never really been on my radar just because short story collections aren't always my go-to, but now I'm curious. So if you've read that collection and think I would enjoy it based off my experience with these two books, let me know in the comments. After reading and processing both of these books, I think I would amend my rating of The Unworthy to 4 stars, and I think I would give Tender is the Flesh about 4.25 stars. So I would say this was overall a successful, if not completely bonkers week of reading. Very intense, very bracing, but interesting nonetheless. Like I said, I don't think this author's work is going to be for everyone, and that's totally fine, and I would also not blanket recommend either of these books to just anyone. I would have to know someone's reading taste and their capacity very well before recommending either of these, but I do appreciate what this author is trying to get across in her work and the narrative choices that she makes to convey those really important messages. If you've read either of these books or anything by Agustina Bastarrica, I would love to hear your thoughts, so definitely stop by the comments. But that is a wrap on this reading vlog. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you found it interesting, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye!